Okay, good Friday morning, uh, friends, and welcome back to the Urban Ecology Center's Backyard Naturalist series. My name is Tim. I will be your host this morning on this beautiful April 5th, 2024. The sun is shining. We are full on into spring after the beautiful freezing rain and snow and regular rain and the wintry spring mix that we've had the last few days. But here we are, connected through technology, like a television screen, but better. Today's topic is snails, because why not? They're pretty amazing. They're super recognizable no matter your age. Just about any kid or adult could draw you a snail. They're super adaptable. They've been immensely successful, and they're also in a little bit of trouble. So let's sit back in our own homes that we don't carry around with us for episode 31 of season 5 of the Backyard Naturalist. You've got Snail. And thank you for watching us today with our regular weekly nod to PBS, whose catchphrase we shamelessly borrow each week. I'm glad you're here. And an immense amount of gratitude to our subscriber community. We say it often, but you keep this program going, and that makes me happy because I really enjoy hanging out with this wonderful group of humans every week. We had a particularly fun conversation before this one. And subscribers also get to register for our monthly field trips for free. Sorry, Jenny, we are going to get up in your area at some point, maybe. But the next one is Downer Woods, April 27th. We're going to get a tour of Downer Woods with UWM professor Allison Donnelly. She studies phenology, climate change. She gave a wonderful presentation to you all a few weeks ago. These trips are open to everyone, free to subscribers. You can register on the UEC website, and this really is a hidden gem in the middle of the UEC or the UWM campus. And once again, I'm excited to mention the Backyard Naturalist Summer Course, which now has a name, Step into Ecology. And the description, join us to discover a variety of terrestrial and aquatic habitats where we'll observe patterns, learn about natural history, and discuss ecological and evolutionary questions. Over 6 sessions this summer, we'll explore our parks, tap into our creativity, and connect with nature and each other. This course is designed to sit at the intersection of science and humanities. While we'll learn a lot about ecology, there will also be elements of art and mindfulness that will encourage you to pursue, and all are welcome. And Backyard Naturalist subscribers get a discount on the course fee. And we continue to spread word about our next eco travel trip to Costa Rica at the end of the summer. This is an accessible opportunity for folks who might need accommodations in travel, as we partner with a local agency that specializes in the creation of tailor-made travel experiences. And I probably don't need to say anything more about what's happening on April 8th. As I mentioned earlier, I did a terrible job of planning our trip during a total solar eclipse to the Galapagos, especially when the path of totality is so close to where I live, to where you live, to so many urban areas, populated areas in North America. It's dubbed the Great North American Eclipse. Even if you can't make it to the path of totality, you can still watch a partial eclipse from a lot of places. Just please don't look at the sun directly. Always protect your eyes with approved eclipse glasses or other approved methods. And we're all going to be praying to the gods of clear skies. We got a couple of uh, meteor showers coming up, and there's also a maybe lesser hype than the eclipse, but a very cool event leading up to April 21st. The comet Pons Brooks is making its 71-year cycle approach to the sun. And those wonderful astronomy folks have called this comet to be, have a similar shape to the Star Wars Millennium Falcon, or like the horns of the devil. Um, and as it gets closer to the sun, the comet gets brighter and the tail gets longer. And there's some folks that are going to try to get a look at this during the April 8th solar eclipse, because that'll be a good time to look for it. And then the meteor showers I was talking about, we have the Eta Aquarids, which are every year when the Earth passes through the debris left by the comet Halley. This year, the peak occurs the morning of May 6th, which also coincides with the new moon, which is what you want. And but you can start looking for the meteors pretty soon, around April 15th. And then the other big meteor shower coming up is the Lyrid meteor shower, which is caused by debris from the comet Thatcher. The peak is April 21st, 22nd, emanating from the constellation Lyra. Unfortunately, peak activity this year is during a nearly full moon, which will dampen the show a bit. But over the next few weeks, month and a half, is a good time to look for meteors. Unfortunately, or fortunately for you, the best time to usually see these is before sunrise. Once the Earth kind of passes that midnight hour and it's going into the path, you just tend to see them more often. But you can still look for them after sunset as well. And then we're getting ready for another lunar mission. We've had a little bit of a break. This one could launch soon. It's the Chang'e 6, which is going to be launched by the Chinese Space Agency. And the goal of this mission is to gather materials from the far side of the moon, the side we don't see, and then bring them back to Earth for scientists to study. Okay, so we're ready to talk snails. Just want to recognize that I got a lot of sources of information. One of the primary ones is the How Stuff Works website. It's one that I've used for decades. Tons of useful and useless information there, videos and articles. And then the spin-off podcast, very popular podcast, Stuff You Should Know, which is a Tim Bargo favorite. And we're also revisiting another Tim Bargo favorite for this episode, Ologies with Ali Ward. I feel like she and her podcast interviewing really cool people were the primary sources of information for a lot of the early years of Backyard Naturalist. So it was a good to kind of visit an old friend for this episode too. And recently she interviewed a grad school colleague of Jenny and ours at Purdue, Karen Monroe, on squirrels. So it's another wonderful podcast. But here we are talking about snails. And the study of snails, or the ology for the podcast, is grouped under the term malacology, which means the study of soft things. It's the study of mollusks, and the mollusks are a very diverse phylum of animals, a big old group. So a malacologist could be anything from a snail scientist to an octopus scientist to a chitin scientist to a clam scientist. And then one of the first things that Josh and Chuck noted in their podcast is that there appears to be a dearth of academic research on snails, and Ali Ward also reinforced that. Apparently, there aren't a lot of people studying them, at least compared with other groups. And so a lot of what we learned about snails in particular comes from backyard gardeners, amateur naturalists, regular folks. And there are no malacology graduate programs in the United States. So Ali Ward was able to find the Malacology and Invertebrate Paleontology Collections Curator at the Natural History Museum of LA, who is an urban malacologist. But plenty of opportunity here for all you budding scientists to blaze a slime trail into malacology in the United States. So snails belong to the gastropod class, along with the slugs and sea slugs and conchs and whelks and limpets. We have already featured a gastropod on Backyard Naturalist a few years back with slugs. So I'm not going to repeat all the things that were in that episode. If you want to go back for really kind of basic biology, basic taxonomy, a lot of that applies to snails. So I'm not going to repeat a lot of that. 150,000 species of gastropods have been named by Western science, at least. And snails and slugs kind of take that same, they're in the same order. They separate at family, but really culturally, any gastropod that has a coiled shell is something we call a snail, whether they're related or not. There is no ology for snails. Slugs have their own ology called limacology, but snails do not have anything yet. That's an injustice. So there are sea snails, freshwater snails, unrelated from each other, unrelated from the terrestrial snails, but altogether there's about 35,000 species. And when gastropods kind of look like a snail and they don't have a shell, or they're usually called slugs. And then my new favorite is that you have gastropods that have a coil shell, but they're too small to retract into, so they're called semi-slugs. So yeah, great name. The backyard typical terrestrial land snails that you would find in your backyard usually fall into the family Helicidae. Snails in general are incredibly old in the fossil record. The usually, I mean, obviously, as a soft-bodied animal, the bodies themselves don't appear in the fossil record, but their shells do, and they're about as widespread as you can get. You often say that a group or like this group or that group is found everywhere in the world except Antarctica. But snails incredibly can be found in Antarctica. They can also be found in some of the hottest, driest deserts in the world, which doesn't seem to fit for an animal that requires moisture for survival. If it dries up, it dies. Um, the largest terrestrial land slug, which we were talking about before the talk today, that Sunny and Mitch had found, is the aptly named African giant snail. So you can see here for scale, the human hand, the when they measure the snails, they measure the shells, and the shell itself can be 8 inches long, which is incredible, 4 inches in diameter. So this is the African giant snail on the one extreme, and then you have the recently discovered, um, the smallest snail in the world was recently discovered in caves in Cambodia and Vietnam. So small they can fit inside a grain of sand. So this is an adult snail wedged into the eye of a needle. So very big and very small. And you wouldn't really know they were snails until you looked at them through a microscope, probably. About 500 species native to North America. Um, and for the most part, our snails are under threats. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But when you look at a snail, the most notable part of it is that thing that generally lets us know we're looking at a snail is the shell. So unlike a hermit crab that has to find its shell, the snail is born shell and all. Hatched out of the egg, its shell is already there to become an adorable mini snail. There's no cocoon or metamorphosis or starting naked and the shell comes later. It comes out of the egg with a fully formed shell. The shell itself doesn't grow like outward, but it grows as a spiral. So just like if you were, making a spiral on a piece of paper, you start small and you just get bigger as you go out. And that's how the snail shell grows. It starts adding to the open end of the spiral. Um, so when you look at this baby shell on the right, that part of the shell is still going to be around in the adult shell. It'll just kind of stick around in the center and rotate around and around as it grows. And so that makes it aging a snail. One of the ways you can do that is to study the shell, like you count rings in a tree. Also, because of this outward growth, that middle part of the shell is not only the oldest part, it's also the hardest part because new shell growth takes a while to completely harden. And so then the weakest part of a snail shell is the outer part, the part closest to its body. Um, and the most likely reason that a snail has this shell is for protection. So protection from many different things, protection from predators, protection from falling, protection from the weather, protection, but probably most importantly is protection from drying out. Snails require moisture to live, and the shell makes a really good waterproof or close to waterproof outer shell. The opening of the shell has kind of a front door lid that they can close, like the hinge of a turtle, and they can hide in it, and that's called an epiphragm, not a diaphragm, but an epiphragm. And then sometimes that epiphragm not only shuts tight, it also has like armor in it, either tiny denticles or in this case just little bigger teeth. And then sometimes those denticles are not just in the inner part of the shell, they're on the outer part of the shell. So in this case, the shell is serving very much for protection as well as for moisture retention. And that entire snail body is completely twisted up in that shell. And all you have sticking out of the opening or the aperture is the head and then one of its feet. So if you think of a twister game where you have to put your head down by your left foot and then somebody wraps your entire upper body into a shell, which seems extremely uncomfortable. But then not only is your body in that shell, your body is twisted around in that shell clockwise, and that's called torsion. So if you imagine you have like a hoop and you twist both sides, it turns into a figure eight. So in snail development, their neural uh pathway, their neural circuits, their breathing tubes, that all gets kind of twisted into that figure eight, kind of doubled back 180 degrees. And then through time, they've lost their entire right side of the body. So really, you look at symmetrical uh, organisms, obviously, other than like the central systems, which they have to keep, anything that was just kind of a right side, left side, that is gone. So um, really, you have your head, and then the left foot essentially is what comes out of the body, all smushed in a tiny spot. The butt is located right there too, because it's got to, not only eat and breathe from that opening, it also has to poop. There is, a debate among the malacologists community about why it was all twisted like this. And because like you know, when I think of a snail, I just think of that shell as kind of like a hump. At least that's what I thought. It was like a camel hump, or if you look at a slug, sometimes they have those like somewhat protected. So I just thought it was like everything was long in there like a slug, but it's not. It's all twisted and contorted up in that shell. Um, and one of the hypotheses is that it provides uh balance. Very unlikely. One of the hypotheses is that from the days when they were in the ocean, um, uh, that getting everything up into that shell was harder for a predator to come and grab it by the tail. That's also probably unlikely. The most likely hypothesis is because it really allows um, everything to retract faster. If the way it's set up, it doesn't have to bring in the head and the tail. It really just brings in it from an anatomical perspective. It's able to just really get the head and foot in very fast when it needs to. So apparently the way it's engineered, that's, a really fast way to do it. All this twisting and torsion happens during larval development in the egg, the circulatory and nervous systems, twisting counterclockwise. Snails are very good at eating. They've got a powerful mouth, whether they're eating meat or plants. Often have very sharp radular teeth. For the aquatic snails, I used to love to watch the snails just kind of scoop along the sides of the fish tanks, and just like I don't know, it's very something mesmerizing about watching that. And then they have those really fascinating eyes on the end of the stalks, which can range from fairly simple eyes that just see light and dark, to more complex eyes that can sense movement, to eyes that can actually see images. So if that snail is staring at you, might be staring at your face. Um, it's cool that the eyes can tuck into the stalk can tuck into the head, and the head can tuck into the shell, and that all can happen very, very quickly if there's danger. And then if it needs to see if the danger is gone, it doesn't have to bring everything out. It can just take that one little eye part out and look around to see if the coast is clear. They can't hear, no ears, but they do plenty okay without a sense of hearing. And then a really important part of that shell is called the mantle, and that's the area around that opening, the outside of the shell. It connects the head and the foot to the shell. It holds, there's a high concentration of blood vessels. Lungs are in that area for oxygenation, and they can be just like the eyes. They can be very simple lungs with opening, kind of like in insects, where there's just a really passive oxygen exchange, or they can be complex lungs with breathing in and out, forced air. Or in aquatic snails, it's usually more like gills. So very wide range of complexity in the eyes, very wide range of complexity in the lungs. And then, when you think of that epiphragm and your diaphragm, your diaphragm kind of, in some senses, also holds your guts together. And it's the same with the epiphragm in the snail and the mantle. It's kind of holding all those guts where they're supposed to be. Um, and then the other really important part of the mantle is that it's where the shell grows. So it's just kind of the source of outward growth in the shell, um, mostly calcium carbonate and some proteins. And then after the shell, another very important part of snail life is the mucus trail. So as snails move along a terrain, uh, constantly secreting mucus from the foot, from their left foot. So the rippling muscles that propel the snail forward are also laying the mucus in a well rehearsed symphony. Um, the mucus has it. I don't know if it's non-Newtonian, but it's a complex. So it can be simultaneously strong, very strong. It can hold a snail to a wall. It can allow a snail to climb up a wall. And it also has lubricating properties as it's allowing the snail to move across any terrain, and it offers a layer of protection. So separating the body from the terrain, if there's pointy things on the ground, it won't penetrate the scale. It allows that it's just like a cushion layer. Um, very good at retaining moisture, and because of that, the trails, the mucus trails, also are used in human cosmetic products to treat dry skin. And then another really important property of that trail, it tells other snails uh, where this snail is going, where it's been. Because for an organism that has to move so slowly, like a fast top speed for a snail would be like a half inch every second, um, which seems fast and slow to me at the same time. But if you're moving so slow and you're looking for a mate or any kind of communication with other snails, it could take you forever to find one. And so the snail trail really serves a purpose of finding other snails. And obviously one of the main reasons you'd find another snail is to mate. And so these snail trails aid in helping the snails find each other. And if they do find a mate, for such a slow moving animal, uh, it really pays to be hermaphroditic, meaning that they have both male and female sex organs on the same animal, because then whoever you find is a potential mate, doesn't matter. So it's just, slugs and earthworms have that. And for all those animals, if once they leave, after they're done mating, you often both individuals have fertilized eggs, both individuals are pregnant. So if it took you forever to find another snail and it wasn't the form that could work with you to fertilize eggs, and you just have to keep looking. Um, and snail and slug courtship are both crazy. So I think back in the day when we could share videos before the YouTube folks cracked down on it, we have a really good slug courtship video, leopard slug courtship video that is, of course, narrated by David Attenborough. The snail courtship takes 4 to 12 hours. You can imagine, in such a small or slow animal. And 4 to 12 hours before they actually mate. And they're just kind of dancing around each other, touching tentacles, biting each other's lips. And then there's something really just bizarre that happens. Um, Snails have what's called a love dart, and it's not necessary for reproduction, but it helps reproduction if it's works right. So the love dart doesn't form until after its first mating. It takes about a week to form after the first mating, and it's like a sack with a harpoon dart, and then it forcefully injects that into its partner. Um, and they have crazy bad aim with this thing. Like a third of the time, it doesn't even work. Sometimes it'll, penetrate an organ, or it'll go completely through the head of the other snail and out the other side. Um, and I don't know. You'd think that to do this, like, well, maybe this is delivering sperm. And so maybe that's just a surefire way that, like, I'm gonna get the sperm in, but it's not. There's no sperm. It's what it's doing is it's creating a trail of hormones that protect the sperm on the way to the eggs. So it's not necessary for successful reproduction, but it helps. And it's not always ready to go. So it's just such a bizarre, in my opinion, extra step to have evolved in reproduction. But this is a very old and very successful group, so I'm can't really question that. Um, After mating, again, both individuals might be fertilized, might have fertilized eggs, and then depending on the species, 400 or 500 eggs a year. Um, Gestation could be a day after fertilization. They could be laying fertilized eggs, um, or it could take a month or longer. And in some species of snails, it really pays to be the first one to hatch because, some snails are carnivores, some are not. And if you are a carnivorous snail and you're the first to hatch, you've got your meal right in front of you with all your other siblings, all the other eggs, and you can start to eat them to get a head start. Or even if they've already hatched and you're bigger than them, you might eat the live sibling. Most snails don't do this. Most snails start off just eating vegetation. They're very good at it. Um, and in the lovely stories, the snail parents stick around up to 3 months to protect eggs and newly hatched young. And they live surprisingly very long lives for such little squishy creatures. So in the wild, they can easily live 5 years. In captivity, they've been known to live 25 years or more. Some people swear they're the best pets to have. And yeah, I guess if you've got a snail for 25 years, you're developing a pretty close bond with that snail. And after they hatch, they just kind of go out in the world and become snails. Um, the vast majority of snails are going to live in anywhere that's damp, that's moist. Oftentimes that's that humus layer of vegetation near the ground, of a forest or a prairie or your backyard. They're mostly active at night because it's cooler. You don't have to worry about drying out so much, and then dew will collect overnight that allows them to kind of replenish their moisture for the daytime. And like I said, they can eat live plants, they can eat live meat, but for the most part, they're specializing in decaying vegetation, animal, plant, or otherwise. And so they're a very important decomposer in ecological communities, recycling plant matter, changing nutrients to become available to other life forms. They themselves are also an important part of the food chain. A lot of animals are deal with a scarcity of calcium, and so getting a snail, even a small snail, you're going to be getting a lot of calcium for your body in addition to protein. Um, they move things around in plant communities. They provide drainage. They can even be pollinators. Um, and so very important member of the ecosystems. But they do like especially the ones that eat live vegetation, that can bring them into conflict with the gardener or the homeowner. So probably okay that they're eating weeds, but the typical burgundy snail, the Roman snail, which is the main escargot snail, can eat about 6 grams of plants in a night. Live plants, it's about 30% of its body weight. So again, if they're eating weeds or decaying vegetation, that's okay, but they do have a taste for live vegetation, and that might be your hostas or the seedlings that you just planted. And I haven't seen an effective snail fence like a rabbit fence. So unfortunately, a lot of folks do resort to chemical means to get rid of snails from their gardens or their crops. I always don't think that's such a great idea because you're just adding chemicals to the soil. You're affecting a lot of other living things. If it's a garden, you're getting those chemicals on your food. Generally seems like a bad idea. If you're an organic gardener, they do allow you to use ferrophosphate pesticides, which interrupts the snail's ability to digest, and so they starve to death, unfortunately. There's also a metaldehyde, which is banned in Europe, but not in the good old USA. The metaldehyde desiccates snails, but it also can cause undue harm to other birds, mammals, and other life in your plot. Some folks will introduce predators, and on a massive scale, that can be terrible. But I would encourage folks to, you got a lot of native predators in your garden, maybe move some of those native insect predators into your garden. That might, couldn't hurt. Um, uh, but the best solution, in my opinion, that Josh and Chuck mentioned, is to just go at night with a flashlight. You'll find the offending animals that are eating what you don't want them to eat, pluck them off the plant, and then move them over to your compost bin because that's where you want them. They're going to go nuts there. You're helping them, they're helping you. because you do want snails in your backyard for all the important real roles that you know that I mentioned earlier, and any way you can make sure that there's more natives than the exotics, that's even better. Um, Mentioned that a lot of snails are under threat. A lot of native snails in particular. You have quite a few species populations that are crashing. You have quite a few extinctions, similar to the threats of our native bees. And in the case of snails, the main perpetrators are, like a lot of things, the exotic invasive snails that come here and do very well. Um, Snails that are introduced to an area where they don't have their natural predators and are able to kind of take over. So the Roman snail, the Burgundy snail, is one of the main problems brought over for food. This is the snail, like I said, usually you have when you're eating escargot. This is the snail. Um, and then restaurants might have live supplies of them, and they'll either escape or the restaurant closes down or it just needs to deal with a surplus, and they dump them in the local stream, and then they just have a field day. I remember banding in Lincoln Park along the Milwaukee River one time, and there was a huge outbreak of these kinds of snails along the Milwaukee River. They were just everywhere. And I think a local news source tracked them back to a restaurant. Um, it wasn't there. There was a French restaurant in the old Prospect Mall for those of you who were in the Milwaukee in the 80s. Le Petit France, I think it was called. Uh, and that was where I thought it was like super cool to eat snails. I thought I was cool because I was eating snails, but then my older, more sophisticated self realized that it was just the butter and garlic that I craved, and actually, it was that butter and garlic was probably giving me a headache anyway. But the fact that I was eating snails was great. So, what were we talking about? Burgundy snails. Uh, Part of the global culinary experience, like me, like a status symbol, like the Perrier water bottles. So spreading around the world, becoming a nuisance, a threat to native snails. You also have snail eggs, a delicacy known as white caviar, sells for about $75 an ounce, which is actually quite a bit cheaper than the other white caviar you may have heard of, which comes from sturgeon eggs. Um, but all part of this popularity of snails and threats to native snails. And then another major threat is that aforementioned African giant snail. And this isn't a case because we eat them. This is a case because it's really big in the pet trade. So it's cool that Sunny and Mitch were able to see them in their native habitats. But or maybe they were introduced there too. Probably were. Anyway, very popular pet. Um, and you can also imagine that a huge snail like this has a big appetite, and it does. And so if it escapes, and which it will, it's known to eat over 500 species of plants, both native and decorative. It's become a really big problem, surprise, in Florida. Um, and not only because it's escaped and it's causing all the havoc in the natural system, apparently they also have a case for or a taste for stucco in your houses. Probably eating the stucco for the calcium, and you can imagine those razor sharp denticles just being able to plow through that stucco pretty quickly. So the threat is environmental, the threat is to your house, and the threat from this in particular and other snails is that they carry diseases. Diseases is sometimes a natural defense, but sometimes it's just a vector for diseases, like a lot of things. So the African giant snail can carry rat longworm, which can lead to meningitis in humans. It can be a threat to you, to your pets. This is where the PSA of not eating snails from your garden comes in. If in and anytime you handle a snail, just make sure you wash your hands, but definitely don't eat them. They can make you quite sick. But back to Florida. Apparently, Florida was this hotbed for these snails in the pet trade. And then, as our wonderful economic system does, you had somebody making a lot of profit transporting these from Florida to Hawaii for their native threat side, and then once they're in Hawaii, it's done. Uh, it's become a huge problem there. Pretty much decimated. Well, this and another snail we're talking about have pretty much decimated the native snails in Hawaii. Quite a few extinctions. And then of course the pet trade brought them to Polynesia, where they're continuing to wreak havoc. They're kind of like the cane toads of the snail world. But the carnage doesn't stop there. because in Hawaii back in the 50s, that us wonderful smart humans thought, okay, we've got this problem with this big African giant snail that's everywhere. So let's bring in another snail. It'll take care of the African giant snails. It's this massive predator. It's like the great white shark of the snail world. It's called the rosy wolf snail. It's how can a snail be bad if it's got rosy in its name? Um, and so they're like, okay, rosy wolf snails, go and kill all these giant African snails. And the rosy snails were like, "Are you kidding me? Those things are huge. I've got a lot of other really great prey here that I'm going to go after." So not only did they not go after the snails they wanted them to, they pretty much decimated everything else. And I, they are an amazing predator when they're hunting. They can move 2, 3 times faster than when they're not hunting. Um, they're and if you're being chased by one of these and you're a snail, um, you're a goner. They'll chase you up a tree. They'll chase you underwater. Pretty much once it has their sights on you, you're pretty much a goner. They will they will swallow other snails, shell and all. A researcher counted 13 snails in the gut of one rosy wolf snail at one time. Um, and closer to home, another invasive species that's taken over and probably taken over to the point that we just think it's our common garden snail. It's called the common garden snail. Also imported for food, and also escaped from farms. But yeah, because in our lifetimes, this is what's common here. And we just think of it as the local snail, but it's not native. It's imported from Europe, but taken over as the dominant snail role in these parts. So these and many other species that we talk about here are synanthropic species, and that means they do very well in human environments. We provide great environments for certain species, and the garden snail is one of them. And like we do with a lot of other synanthropic species, humans have a long relationship with snails. This is kind of crazy. There's evidence that early humans used snail shells as necklaces 120,000 years ago. So we're not talking Homo sapiens. We're talking about Homo sapiens, yes, but also other species of humans that are decorating themselves with snails. And a more recent example, Patricia Highsmith, author of Strangers on a Train and The Talented Mr. Ripley, was like one of the very first snails as pets champions, and she took it to an extreme. She apparently would bring her pet snails, dozens of pet snails in her purse to parties, as talking companions because it was easier to talk to a snail than a human. And again, if a snail lives 20 years with them, you're really developing quite a relationship. Um, and snails also play an important part in Alzheimer's research for a couple of reasons. They're really getting a better understanding of helping us get a better understanding of the mechanism, the how and the why that the disease progresses. And then also the properties in their slime in particular are known to be bioactive. So anti-inflammatory, antioxidant, anti-apoptotic, meaning they prevent cell death. So a lot of importance in biomedical. They're sacred in many cultures around the world, particularly the giant African snail in parts of Western Africa. And an interesting bit of trivia here, a lot of illuminated manuscripts from France in the 13th century, and then again they became popular in the 15th century, often show in the margins these knights battling giant snails. And the thought is that either this signified like strength, because if you're able to slay an animal that is so strong that it can carry its house, uh, the other theory, which I like a lot better, is that those 13th century and 15th century authors were just adding humor to their manuscripts, like the cartoons in New Yorker magazine or Mad magazine, just little bits of humor decoration. Um, so that's it for snails. And I, I don't know. It obviously could have said a lot more, and there's a lot of really cool. I'll send a couple short documentaries that are really really fun in the next time I send out a link. And yeah, I just I forget that they're there. and I forget how much fun it is to just take a flashlight in your backyard at night, and see what's around in your backyard. So thank you for joining me today. We'll see you next time. I will stop